The afternoon sun beat down on the Savannah bus stop like a hammer, and Elena Martinez stood motionless under the metal canopy, her hospital badge clipped to her scrubs catching the light. St. Michael's Memorial was 3 blocks back. The number 42 bus was 12 minutes late. She knew this because she always knew exactly how long things took, how long a 4-line held, how long a body could survive without oxygen, how long she could stand in one place without the weight of invisible metals pressing against her ribs like stones. Her pen moved across the transfer form in her hand with mechanical precision, a 3-finger grip that looked ordinary to anyone watching. Most nurses held pens, however, felt natural. Elena held hers the way combat medics in the 160th SAW held them when signing morphine logs under fire in Kandahar, when the wind from helicopter rotors threatened to scatter the documentation and every second mattered because a soldier's life depended on the exact dose being recorded, being remembered, being written down. The grip was muscle memory. The grip was proof. She wore the scrubs like armor. Navy blue, St. Michael's logo embroidered on the left breast, name badge with RN credentials, her face in the photo looking younger than she felt. For years on the job. For years of yes, doctor, and right away, doctor, and I'll handle it, doctor, her voice pitched carefully lower than it wanted to go, her hands kept visible and calm, her presence small enough that people forgot she was in the room. That was the point. That was the entire design. The bus stop filled gradually with a late afternoon crowd. Office workers with collapsed umbrellas. A woman pushing a stroller. An elderly couple sharing a bench. And then Marcus Webb arrived, moving slowly, his 10th Mountain Division ball cap faded from the sun, his hands carrying weight that had nothing to do with the papers he was holding. Elena recognized the walk immediately, not because of his disability, but because of how he moved through space like someone who'd learned to navigate terrain under fire, where the ground itself was hostile. He approached the ticket window where Richard Lowell sat in his transit authority uniform, a man in his mid-50s with the bloated face of someone who'd convinced himself that management was the same as authority. Lowell's shirt strained at the buttons. His tie was loosened. He didn't look up from his paperwork as Marcus stepped to the window. Marcus held up his disabled veteran transit voucher. It was laminated, worn at the edges. His hands moved next, controlled, deliberate sign language that carried the precision of military communication. Veteran. His hand shaped the letters. Expire date. He pointed to the expiration line on his voucher. Lowell didn't move. Didn't acknowledge the signs. Just kept writing on whatever form was in front of him, the scratch of his pen the only sound under the metal canopy. The air tasted like diesel exhaust and heat. Elena felt her jaw tighten. She forced it loose again. The problem with people like Lowell was that they mistook disinterest for power. They believed that not acknowledging someone's existence was a form of dominance, when it was actually just cowardice wearing a uniform. Elena had seen this in every institution, hospitals, military compounds, transit authorities. Men who'd climbed just high enough to make other people's lives difficult and then convinced themselves it meant something. 2 subordinates stood behind Lowell's booth, younger men in transit uniforms, clipboards in hand. They noticed Marcus's attempts to communicate and exchanged looks, not hostile exactly, just the casual dismissal of people who'd learned from their supervisor that some people didn't matter. Elena watched this happen. She was good at watching. She'd been trained to watch, to observe, to read rooms the way other people read books. Marcus tried again. His hands moved more slowly, more deliberately, as if volume and clarity worked the same way whether you were deaf or hearing. Veteran. The sign came with his finger pointing to his chest, to his hat, to the evidence of who he was. Need help. Voucher. Expired. Lowell set down his pen. He leaned back in his chair. He was doing something with his face, a smile, maybe, but the kind that only muscles understand how to make, the kind without anything behind it. He tapped his fingers on the desk once. Twice. 3 times. Elena shifted her weight. Her badge caught the light again. Elena Martinez, RN, in white lettering. The name on the badge was not the name she'd been born with, but it was the one she'd become. It was the name that appeared in St. Michael's Memorial's personnel records, in the nursing shift database, on the parking pass that hung from her rearview mirror. The patch inside her jacket felt heavier than usual. Lowell stood up. He pushed open the booth door and stepped out into the covered bus stop area, and his presence changed the temperature of the space, not because he was threatening, but because he was loud in the way that only unexamined privilege gets loud, the way power that comes from systems rather than competence always announces itself. He approached Marcus, and Elena noted the distance, 1 meter, close enough to intimidate, far enough to maintain what Lowell probably thought was professionalism. "Sir." Lowell's voice carried across the entire canopy. "If you can't fill out a simple form, maybe you shouldn't be riding public transportation." The words landed. Elena watched them land on Marcus like shrapnel. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the laughter that came next. One of the subordinates in the booth tried to swallow it, but it escaped anyway, a snort that the other one echoed. 2 younger men, learning how to be the kinds of men they were working for. Elena's hands didn't move. Her face stayed smooth. She was very good at staying smooth. She'd had years of practice, years of watching men like Lowell say things that deserved answers, deserved confrontation, deserved something more than the silence she provided. But the silence was the mask. The silence was what kept Elena Martinez the quiet nurse on the afternoon shift, the one people forgot was in the room. Marcus's hands dropped to his sides. He folded the voucher carefully, as if it mattered now whether it stayed in perfect condition, and he turned away from the window. He didn't look angry. He looked like something had been confirmed in him, some deep and painful assumption about how the world worked. Elena watched him move back toward the bench. Watched him sit down. Watched his jaw set the way jaws set when people were holding things in. She knew that look because she saw it in her bathroom mirror most mornings, the look of someone carrying weight that the rest of the world could never understand. And then, without being aware that she was doing it, Elena moved. Not dramatically. Not in any way that would draw attention. She simply stood, gathered her transfer form, and walked toward the ticket window where Marcus sat closest to the bench. She sat down next to him, close enough that her shoulder nearly touched his, and she set her pen down on the empty space between them. Lowell was back in his booth. The subordinates had returned to their clipboards. The bus stop resumed its ordinary afternoon hum, the fluorescent lights buzzing, the distant sound of traffic, the occasional squeak of the metal benches. Nobody was watching. Nobody would have noticed Elena's hands if they were looking, the way she held the pen in that careful 3-finger grip that meant something to exactly 4 people in the world, all of them long gone. She didn't speak. Marcus didn't need her to speak. What he needed was someone to sit with him in that particular kind of silence, the kind that existed between people who understood that some injuries weren't visible and some authority wasn't earned. The number 42 bus arrived 6 minutes later, hissing air brakes, the doors opening with a pneumatic wheeze. Elena stood up. She looked at Marcus, actually looked at him, met his eyes, held the gaze steady the way people who'd survived things understood. Then she picked up her pen, tucked it back into her pocket, and boarded the bus. It wasn't until she was sitting 3 rows back, watching the city roll past the window, that Elena realized Marcus had not gotten on. He was still at the bench. Still waiting. Still holding his voucher. She pressed her hand against her ribs, against the patch inside her jacket, the faded fabric with its unit designation that no longer officially existed, and she felt something crack inside her, not visible, not audible, but real nonetheless. A small shift in the machinery of pretense. A reminder that sometimes the hardest battles weren't with people like Lowell. Sometimes they were with yourself. The afternoon sun hammered the Savannah bus stop like a judge's gavel, heat rising off asphalt in waves that made the air shimmer. Nearly 40 people clustered under the covered shelter, waiting in the stagnant air that smelled of diesel exhaust and melting asphalt. Richard Lowell stood at the center of the crowd like a conductor before an orchestra, clipboard in one hand, the other gesturing with theatrical precision at Marcus Webb, who sat on the metal bench with his weathered hands trembling slightly as he tried to communicate his need for a disabled transit voucher. "We get freeloaders like this every week," Lowell announced, his voice carrying across the entire shelter with the deliberate volume of a man who wanted an audience. He was a rail-thin man in his 50s with the kind of posture that suggested he'd spent decades perfecting the art of making himself taller than he actually was. His two subordinates, both younger, both wearing identical Transit Authority polo shirts, stood flanking him like bookends, their faces already arranged into smiles that waited for the punchline they knew was coming. Elena stood 3 rows back, her hospital scrub still damp with the morning's humidity, watching. She wasn't looking at Lowell. Her attention was entirely on Marcus, on the careful way the older man's shoulders had begun to collapse inward, the way his eyes had started to retreat somewhere distant. She'd seen that look before. She'd worn it once, a long time ago. Perfectly healthy, Lowell continued, turning to face the crowd directly now, playing to them. Pretending they can't hear so they don't have to pay full fare. It's a beautiful scheme, really. I have to admire the creativity. One of his subordinates laughed, a sharp, barking sound that seemed to crack the heat-stalled air. Marcus's face flushed crimson. His hands moved in the fluid, graceful motions of American Sign Language, trying to explain, trying to communicate what his voice couldn't. The letters formed DEAF service. Veteran. The words that should have mattered. That's when Lowell began to mock him. His hands came up, flapping, jerking, exaggerated movements that bore no resemblance to actual sign language, movements designed to look ridiculous. He twisted his face into a grotesque parody, his mouth hanging slack, his eyes rolling. "Oh, what's that?" he called out in a sing-song voice meant for a toddler. "What's that you're trying to tell me?" His subordinate erupted in laughter, the sound carrying like poison through the shelter. A woman in the crowd, elderly, wearing a church hat, looked away. A younger man pulled out his phone to record, his expression caught between horror and fascination. Nobody intervened. Nobody ever did. Elena's hands remained perfectly still at her sides. She had killed men who were kinder than this. She had held dying soldiers while shells fell around them, had sung to them in Spanish, a language she didn't speak, because the sound of a human voice mattered more than words. She had watched a village burn and carried 3 children out of it and never raised her voice about any of it. Her hands, which could perform emergency cricothyrotomy in the dark by feel alone, remained steady as steel as Lowell continued his performance. She moved forward, stepping through the crowd with the kind of quiet precision that made people instinctively step aside for her without knowing why. Her voice, when it came, was calm and level, the voice of someone stating a fact about the weather. "Sir, he's deaf. I can help him fill out the form." Lowell's performance stuttered to a halt. His hands fell to his sides. He turned to face her fully, and something dangerous flickered across his features, not anger, but something worse. Recognition that he'd been interrupted. That his audience's attention had shifted. "And who are you, Florence Nightingale?" His voice had taken on a new edge, the tone of a man who suddenly realized he wasn't the most important person at the bus stop anymore. He looked her up and down, lingering on her hospital scrubs with visible disdain, taking in her worn trauma shears clipped to her pocket, the bandage on her left hand from a needlestick 2 weeks prior. "Let me guess. You're going to tell me he's a war hero too." He smiled. It was the smile of someone holding an ace he hadn't yet played. "I've worked this route for 12 years, he said, speaking directly to the crowd now, keeping Elena in his peripheral vision. 12 years. I know every scam in this city. This gentleman here probably bought that military hat at a Goodwill in Jacksonville." He pointed at Marcus's faded 10th Mountain Division cap, the one Marcus had worn every day for 34 years, ever since basic training at Fort Drum. "Tell me, Nurse Betty, did you learn sign language from YouTube? That's where all you do-gooders get your expertise these days, right?" His subordinate muttered something that carried just far enough to be heard, bleeding heart. Elena knelt beside Marcus, pulling a pen from her scrub pocket, a standard Bic ballpoint, the kind she carried 17 of because they disappeared constantly, and began to help him with the paperwork. Her hands moved in basic sign language, index and middle finger extended, palm outward. "Hello. She understood only fragments, the formal words taught in required hospital training sessions, but enough to communicate. Enough to matter. Oh, now she speaks hands. Lowell leaned over them, his presence suddenly close, oppressive. How convenient. Tell me, did you learn that from the same YouTube channel? Or do you have some special connection to the deaf community that I don't know about? His subordinate snickered, emboldened now, sensing weakness in Elena's silence. Elena's hands didn't shake as she guided Marcus through the form, printing his service number in the space marked for veteran designation. Her knuckles had gone white around the pen, but that was the only tell. The only indication that anything inside her was responding to the sound of his voice, the mockery, the small cruelties multiplying like bacteria in warmth. She had survived 847 days in Kandahar province. She had survived combat operations that didn't exist in any official record, that had been surgically removed from the historical timeline the way infected tissue is excised from living flesh. She had survived a medical evacuation that went sideways in 2019, an operation that was buried so thoroughly even the classified archives didn't acknowledge it. She had survived becoming legally invisible, her entire military service redacted, her rank erased, her identity filed away in buildings that required retinal scans to enter. She could survive Richard Lowell. Lowell snatched the form from Marcus's lap, holding it up to the light as if searching for evidence of fraud. This voucher's been processed wrong, he announced. Someone's been inflating the reimbursement codes. Probably you, trying to game the system. He looked directly at Elena, and his voice had shifted into something colder. I'm going to need both your names for my report. Fraud investigation. A woman in the crowd, wearing scrubs identical to Elena's, a lab tech from St. Michael's, someone Elena didn't know, called out, "Just let him on the bus." Lowell spun on her with the speed of someone trained in confrontation, his voice dropping into the register of absolute authority. If you interfere with transit authority operations, I can have you removed from this stop permanently. The threat hung in the heat like humidity. The woman said nothing more. He turned back to Marcus, and the performance resumed. Speaking slowly. Speaking loudly. Speaking as if volume could penetrate whatever he believed was broken about this man. No. Free. Rides. For. Fakers. Each word a hammer strike. Elena stood. Her movement was fluid, economical, no wasted motion, no anger visible, just the simple act of placing herself between Lowell and Marcus. From 3 feet away, Lowell could smell the hospital on her, antiseptic and human suffering, the scent of someone who spent 8 hours a day in the presence of pain. His paperwork is in order, Elena said quietly. Her voice hadn't changed. The voucher is valid through September. Lowell stepped closer, invading her space in the way of men who had never been taught the cost of doing so. His voice dropped, became more intimate, more dangerous. You know what I think, Angel of Mercy? I think you and Silent Bob here cooked up this little scheme together. And I'm going to make sure the right people know about it. He pulled his phone from his pocket with the deliberate slowness of someone savoring a moment. His fingers were already moving, already dialing. But his eye stayed on Elena, waiting for fear, waiting for the tremor in her voice that would tell him she understood who he was. Who he'd always be in this world, powerful. That's when Marcus's chest heaved. The movement was wrong. Asymmetrical. The right side of his torso didn't move with the left, the way a body moves when air is where blood should be, when pressure is building in the space between lung and ribs, when physics is slowly collapsing everything toward failure. His hand flew to his chest. His mouth opened but no sound came, which was how it always was for Marcus, but this time it meant something different. This time it meant something had fundamentally broken inside him. His lips began to turn blue. Elena dropped to her knees with the speed of something trained in emergency, her fingers finding Marcus's radial pulse while her other hand tilted his head back, opening the airway. His skin was cool, clammy, the texture of someone whose body was already beginning to fail. She pressed her ear to his chest and listened for the sound of breath moving through lungs, listened for the absence of it. What she heard was silence. And the terrible, unmistakable sound of air where it shouldn't be. "Call 911, she ordered, her voice snapping out with the kind of authority that made 3 people immediately reach for their phones, their hands moving without conscious thought, responding to a command structure they didn't even understand. "Now! Tell them we have a tension pneumothorax, patient turning cyanotic, cardiac compromise imminent." She unbuttoned Marcus's shirt with efficient precision, her fingers reading his ribs like braille, counting down from the clavicle to find the intercostal space. Between ribs 2 and 3, midclavicular line. The exact spot she'd accessed 100 times in field conditions when there was no imaging, no time, no room for hesitation. Lowell pushed through the crowd, his voice rising, "Step away from him. You're not authorized to." Elena didn't hear him. Didn't acknowledge him. Her world had contracted to nothing but Marcus's failing body and the biological clock running in her head, 3 minutes. Maybe 4. After that, cardiac arrest. After that, death. A businessman offered a Swiss Army knife, his hand shaking slightly. A college student produced a bottle of Purell from her backpack. A high school teacher frantically disassembled a ballpoint pen, dumping ink onto the concrete in her panic to make the hollow plastic casing available. Elena poured sanitizer over the knife blade, let it run over her knuckles, over her hands, the same hands that had been signed with the 3-finger tactical grip, the same hands that had been trained in special forces medical protocols that most civilians would never know existed outside of classified operations. She made the incision. The movement was controlled, minimal, precise. Not a desperate action but a technical procedure performed 1,000 times in imagination, performed twice in reality under conditions that would have made most people freeze. The knife penetrated skin and muscle and found the pleural space. There was a sound, a small sound, almost quiet in the noise of the crowded bus stop, but Elena heard it clearly, the hiss of air escaping. Pressure releasing. Physics reversing course. She inserted the hollow pen casing into the opening, held it steady, and watched as Marcus's chest suddenly expanded symmetrically. The color began to return to his lips. Pink. Then normal. Then alive again. His pulse under her fingers accelerated from the panicked flutter of failure into something approaching rhythm. A retired EMT standing near the shelter leaned toward his wife and whispered something Elena heard clearly, probably because he meant her to. "That's a battlefield procedure." Where the hell did a hospital nurse learn that? Elena maintained pressure on the improvised chest tube with one hand, checking Marcus's pulse with the other, her face showing nothing but clinical concentration. The fear that had lived in Marcus's eyes was beginning to fade, replaced by recognition, not of who Elena was, but of what she was. Something trained. Something dangerous. Something that had been forged in places he couldn't quite imagine but understood completely. Sirens wailed in the distance, getting closer. Growing louder. The sound of rescue approaching like thunder rolling across the city. Lowell was on his phone, his voice urgent now, no longer playing to a crowd. "Yes, Councilman Peters. Richard Lowell. We have a situation at the Savannah Transit stop on Victory Drive. Unauthorized medical procedure. Possible liability. I need you to contact St. Michael's administration immediately and inform them one of their nurses is practicing outside her scope of certification." He made a second call before the first had even ended, his free hand gesturing to his subordinates to take photographs, document everything, build the case. His voice was sharp with something Elena recognized, not anger, but fear. The fear of a man who had just watched his narrative break apart, who had just realized that the person kneeling in front of him might be something he'd never have the vocabulary to describe. The sirens grew louder. Marcus's head tilted backward against the metal bench. His right side rose and fell in sharp, asymmetrical gasps, the left side completely still. Blue was creeping into his lips. His eyes went wide with the kind of panic that has no sound. Elena moved before her conscious mind caught up. Muscle memory. Her knees hit the concrete bench. Her fingers were already moving across his chest, finding the landmarks with unhesitating precision. Second rib. Midclavicular line. The hollow where a collapsed lung screened its absence. She didn't ask permission. She didn't hesitate. "I need a pocket knife," she said to the crowd. Not a request. A command. A man in a transit uniform fumbled one from his cargo pocket. Elena held out her palm, and he placed it there. She pulled hand sanitizer from her nursing bag, always carried, always prepared, and ran the blade through the alcohol. 10 seconds. Just enough. Her hands didn't shake. The hollowed pen casing felt impossibly small between her fingers. The plastic barrel of a cheap Bic. She'd performed this exact procedure at forward operating base shank with a 14-gauge angiocath needle and nothing else. This was luxury. The needle went in. Air hissed out. That sound. That specific, unmistakable sound of lung re-inflating. The hiss of air escaping, no, air returning. The sound of rescue. Marcus's body convulsed once, then his breathing deepened. The blue faded from his lips like a photograph developing in reverse. 90 seconds from full panic to stabilization. His eyes found hers, and the terror in them transformed into something else. Recognition, maybe. The look a drowning man gives his rescuer. The paramedics arrived with sirens cutting through the afternoon heat. 2 of them, a senior medic with salt and pepper stubble and a younger woman with quick, efficient movements. They took in the scene in 3 seconds. The pen casing. The pocket knife. Marcus's color returning. The small crowd standing absolutely motionless. The senior medic knelt beside Elena. "What did you do?" Not accusatory. Genuinely interested. "Tension pneumothorax," Elena said. Still kneeling. Still steady. Second intercostal, mid-clavicular. Needle decompression with an improvised catheter. He was hypoxic. Asymmetrical chest rise. BP was probably dropping another 5 to 10 points per minute. The medic nodded slowly. He looked at his partner. He looked back at Elena. That pen decompression bought him the time he needed. Nice work. Elena stood. Brushed her hands on her scrubs. One small movement of her head, acknowledgement, not pride. Richard Lowell stepped forward before the paramedics could load the stretcher. His face had transformed. The arrogance was still there, but underneath it ran something uglier. Fear. The kind of fear a man gets when his carefully constructed narrative suddenly shatters. He pointed at Elena. "I need your names and unit numbers," he said to the paramedics. This woman performed an invasive procedure without authorization. There are liability protocols. She could have made his condition worse. There needs to be documentation. The senior paramedic straightened. "Sir, she saved his life." "That's for the medical board to determine," Lowell said. His smile was thin. Practiced. The smile of someone who'd learned how to weaponize bureaucracy. He pulled out his phone and aimed it at Elena's hospital badge. The flash went off. Click. Evidence. A paper trail. Elena watched him do it. She didn't move. Didn't object. Didn't say a word. Lowell called after her as she turned to leave. "Ms. Martinez, you'll be hearing from the proper authorities. What you did was reckless endangerment." The words landed like dropped stones, heavy and deliberate. She kept walking. The Transit Authority booth was small and institutional, beige walls, a desk with a computer monitor, a window overlooking the parking lot. Lowell sat inside and pulled the door closed. His hands moved across his keyboard. First call. The number was in his phone's recents. He knew it by heart. Mercer. The man's voice was thin, reedy. The hospital's VP of Risk Management. A man who owed Lowell a favor from 3 years ago when Lowell had quietly helped bury a workers' compensation claim. "We have a situation," Lowell said. He kept his voice low, professional. "There's a nurse at St. Michael's, Elena Martinez, who just performed an authorized surgery in public. Field procedure. No consent, no licensing oversight. She's a cowboy nurse. Dangerous. We need documentation started before she can claim it was some kind of emergency heroics. Silence on the other end. Then, I'll make a call to administration. Second call. The Georgia Board of Nursing. A woman's voice answered. Lowell had her name. Jennifer. They'd met at a hospital fundraiser once. He kept his tone concerned, not accusatory. I need to file a formal complaint, he said. A nurse named Elena Martinez, works at St. Michael's, just performed an invasive medical procedure at a public bus stop without proper authorization. Needle decompression. I have photographs of her hospital badge. I'm concerned about credential verification and scope of practice violations. Can you confirm her licensure status? He could hear the woman typing. I can open an inquiry. We'll need documentation from the hospital. The hospital's already been notified, Lowell said smoothly. It wasn't true. It would be true within minutes. Third call. Councilman Peters. This was the dangerous one. Peters knew about the voucher program. Not all the details, but enough to understand what happened if someone started asking questions about billing discrepancies. It's contained, Lowell said quietly. The incident with a deaf veteran. But Elena Martinez was looking at his paperwork. Specifically at the voucher coding. She's a nurse at St. Michael's. If she starts connecting dots between what she saw and why I might have wanted the veteran's claim processed quickly, we have a problem. Peters's voice was flat. What kind of problem? The kind that ends with audits. The kind that requires someone to explain why veteran transit vouchers went from $47 to $12 between billing and actual delivery. The kind where your wife's position on the hospital board becomes relevant. The silence lasted 3 seconds. I'll make a call, Peters said. Hospital administration. We need this contained before she starts asking questions. Lowell hung up. He sat in the booth listening to the transit station sounds through the window. The buzz of fluorescent lights. The distant sirens. The mechanical voice announcing departures and arrivals. He opened his personal laptop and navigated to a hidden folder. 18 months of spreadsheets. Inflated billing on disabled veteran transit vouchers. He'd been claiming $47 per ride from the city while providing $12 service. The math was beautiful. The difference was his. 47 minus 12 times 463 rides across 18 months. The number was substantial enough to require very careful protection. Marcus Webb's voucher showed altered coding. He'd marked it as a premium distance ride when the actual route was standard distance. The inflation was there, deliberately embedded, because Lowell had discovered 3 months ago that Marcus had started keeping meticulous records. Photos of his receipt stubs. Notes on the actual distances. Elena had held that voucher in her hands long enough to possibly notice the discrepancies. By 4:33 p.m., Elena's phone rang. The number was internal. St. Michael's Hospital Human Resources. Ms. Martinez, you are suspended pending investigation of an incident. The HR director's voice was bureaucratic, careful. Rehearsed. Effective immediately. You need to return your badge and any hospital property by end of business today. Elena sat in her car in the employee parking lot. The leather seat was hot against her back. The steering wheel was too warm to grip. She watched nurses filing in for the evening shift through the windshield. Young ones. Experienced ones. Tired ones. All of them walking into a building she no longer had access to. What investigation? Elena asked. The HR director read from a script. She could hear the papers shuffling. Unauthorized medical intervention. Scope of practice violation. Questions about credential verification. Security will meet you at the employee entrance. Please bring your badge, your access card, and any other hospital property in your possession. Elena hung up. She didn't cry. She didn't shake. She sat in the car and watched the sky turn the specific shade of orange that only happens in Savannah in summer, that shade that looks like something burning from the inside. The walk to the employee entrance took 4 minutes. Security was waiting. A tall man with a radio on his belt and a name tag that said Martinez. Different Martinez. He looked uncomfortable. Ms. Martinez, I'll need to collect your badge and access card. She unbuckled the lanyard from her neck. Placed it in his palm. The badge had her photo from 3 years ago, before the weight loss, before the lines around her eyes deepened. Before everything. Is there a box? Elena asked. For what? My things? Locker? Personal items. The security guard shifted his weight. That's being handled separately. We'll box it and mail it to your address. She nodded. Turn to leave. Ms. Martinez. The guard's voice was quieter. For what it's worth, everyone saw the video. What you did for that veteran. That was real. She didn't respond. She walked through the automatic doors and back out into the heat. The parking lot expanded around her like a field. Her car sat in the space marked with her name. Elena Martinez. The letters were already starting to fade. She sat in the driver's seat with her hands on the steering wheel, and for the first time since the pen decompression, her hands trembled. Not from fear. Not from doubt. From the specific kind of restraint that comes from having already survived worse and knowing you'll survive this too. Elena pushed through the employee entrance at St. Michael's at 5:15 p.m., her scrubs still damp from the afternoon humidity, and saw them waiting. 2 security guards she'd worked alongside for 3 years. Their faces held the specific discomfort of people delivering bad news they didn't believe in. The older one, Marcus, different Marcus, not the veteran, wouldn't meet her eyes. Elena, we need your badge and any access cards, he said, his voice apologetic in a way that made it worse. She unclipped her ID from her pocket without speaking. The plastic was still warm from being pressed against her body. She held it out, watched it disappear into Marcus's palm, and noticed her own hand was perfectly steady. The trembling would come later. Not from fear. From the specific kind of restraint that comes from having already survived worse and knowing you'll survive this too. They flanked her through the hallway, not touching, but positioned like bookends, past the break room where 4 nurses stopped mid-conversation. Someone whispered, "What did she do?" Elena kept her chin level, her face a blank slate. She'd learned this expression in field hospitals where showing emotion could compromise focus. The skill was still there, muscle memory coded deep. The changing room smelled of antiseptic and stale coffee. Her locker had been opened already, hospital policy for security matters. They waited while she removed the essentials, a photo of Miguel at age 12, a protein bar she'd been saving, the lip balm she reapplied before every shift. Then she reached for the jacket on the bottom shelf, the one she'd worn for 3 years, the one with the patch sewn inside the lining. Her fingers lingered on the fabric for half a second before she pulled it free. "We'll need the scrubs too," the younger guard said, apologetic. Elena changed in the bathroom stall, her movements methodical. Blue scrubs exchanged for jeans and a grey t-shirt from her gym bag. She emerged carrying the uniform folded once, then looked at the guard. "Hospital laundry," she said. It wasn't a question. The basement laundry facility was a cathedral of industrial heat and steam, the fluorescent lights humming that specific frequency that made the back of your skull ache. Mrs. Chen, who'd worked there for 16 years, looked up from sorting linens and her face shifted when she recognized Elena. "Elena? You're not on shift tonight." Elena didn't trust her voice, so she just shook her head. She loaded the scrubs into the facility washer, a machine the size of a small car, and added detergent with the efficiency of someone who'd performed the task 100 times. The water roared in, hot enough to kill anything living on the fabric. She sat on the folding table and waited. 37 minutes for the wash cycle. She knew because she watched the digital display count down each second. When the dryer finished, she pulled out the warm scrubs and placed them on the steel table. Then she folded them. Arms creased with parade ground precision, each fold exactly aligned with the one before it. Legs smoothed flat. Collar positioned to form perfect right angles. It took 12 minutes. She could have done it in 2. But her hands needed something to do other than shake, and her mind needed something to do other than think about the call Lowell had made to the Georgia Board of Nursing, about the fabricated complaints he'd filed, about the poisoned references he'd scattered across her professional record like blood in water. Mrs. Chen watched from her station, understanding slowly crossing her face like dawn. "Oh, honey. They're letting you go." Elena nodded once. Her jaw felt like it was locked in a vice. She placed the folded scrubs in the facility's return bin, the fabric still radiating heat against her fingertips. Then she walked out through the loading dock, taking the long route to avoid the main entrance. Security camera she'd seen on the corner of the building pointed away from the exit. She moved into the evening air, thick and wet, carrying the smell of the Savannah River and car exhaust, and walked across the parking lot to her 2009 Honda Civic. She sat in the driver's seat for 20 minutes without starting the engine. Hands gripping the steering wheel at 10 and 2, the exact position taught in every defensive driving course. Her breath came in controlled bursts, 4 counts in, hold for 4, 6 counts out. A technique she'd learned in a field hospital where breathing wrong could alert your hands to the tremor that would kill the patient on your table. Inside her jacket, draped across the passenger seat, the patch pressed against the worn fabric. She pulled it out for the first time in months. Faded olive drab, 10th Mountain Division insignia, the stitching coming loose on one edge. Not her patch. Hers had been buried in Kandahar in 2019, along with the soldier who'd been wearing it when he stopped breathing at 0437 hours despite her hands being steady, her technique being flawless, her will to save him being absolute. This patch had come from a different soldier, one who'd made her promise something before they shipped him home. Never surface. Never use your real name. Never acknowledge the mission because officially it didn't exist and neither did Captain Elena Martinez. She'd kept that promise for 5 years. Her phone buzzed. Text from Miguel, "Mom, are you okay? There's news vans at the bus stop asking about you." Elena set the phone face down on the passenger seat. She looked at the patch in her hands, the edges worn smooth from being handled, the colors faded from years of sweat and sunlight. She thought about Marcus Webb sitting in that wheelchair, oxygen cannula in his nose because a transit supervisor had made a cruelty calculation that the deaf don't deserve basic respect. She thought about Lowell's face when she'd stepped forward to help, the way his expression had shifted from contempt to something uglier, fear, maybe. Fear that someone could see through him. She thought about the 19 calls he'd made in the 14 hours since she'd saved that man's life. 19 calls to allies in city administration, to contacts at the Board of Nursing, to people whose careers he controlled or whose debts to him were substantial. She'd heard about it through the hospital grapevine, always the most accurate source of information about institutional violence, long before the suspension letter arrived. Lowell had spent 18 months skimming disabled transit vouchers, inflating medical costs and pocketing the difference. Enough money to buy a boat. Enough to retire in 5 years. Then Elena had looked too closely at his paperwork while helping Marcus, and Lowell had seen in her face the specific kind of attention that meant she understood what she was seeing. So he'd acted. Not by confronting her directly, but by using the system. Filing complaints that would take weeks to investigate. Planting insinuations in her professional record that would linger for years. Destroying her credibility so thoroughly that even if she reported the fraud, she'd be dismissed as a disgruntled employee acting out of spite. He'd been competent. Strategic. Ruthless. And he'd miscalculated exactly one thing. The patch felt weightless in her hands. She placed it back inside her jacket and draped the jacket across her chest like a shield. Then she started the engine and drove home through the humid Savannah night, past the Spanish moss hanging from the oaks like torn bandages, past the neighborhoods where she'd lived as someone else, someone smaller. She told herself she wouldn't think about tomorrow. Tomorrow would come anyway. Tomorrow there would be legal battles and phone calls and the specific kind of professional destruction that takes years to recover from, if recovery was even possible. Tonight, she would sit with her son and explain why his mother had to disappear again. The black SUV pulled up to the bus stop and the crowd that had gathered, reporters, cameras, bystanders, went absolutely still. The rotors of a helicopter beat the air somewhere 3 blocks away, coming closer. A 2-star general stepped out, his dress blues crisp as origami, and his eyes moved directly to the shadow box in Miguel's trembling hands. The medals caught the Savannah sunlight and threw it back like a signal flare. The general didn't salute the boy. He didn't acknowledge the crowd. His hand came up in a crisp, razor-edged salute directed at the Bronze Star, the Purple Heart, the Combat Medic Badge, at the proof of everything Elena had buried for 7 years. Richard Lowell's face cycled through confusion, anger, then calculation, like a chess player realizing he'd walked into a trap 3 moves ago. His jaw tightened. His hand moved toward his pocket. One of the men beside the general, Pentagon suit, face like a filing cabinet, spoke quietly into a radio. Lowell turned away from Elena, toward the Transit Authority booth where his 2 subordinates had been watching from the shadows. His mouth opened. His hand found his phone. He needed to delete something. He needed to call someone. He needed the world to unsee what it had just witnessed. But the general was already moving, not toward Lowell but toward Elena, and every camera in the plaza pivoted with him like sunflowers. The second suit, taller, with the kind of weathered face that belonged to someone who'd stood in the same kind of dust Elena remembered from Kandahar, stepped forward and the crowd leaned in. His voice was quiet. Almost conversational. The kind of quiet that makes people strain to listen because they understand, somehow, that whispered words carry more authority than shouted ones. Captain Martinez operated under Special Access Program designation Scalpel Wing, he said. His eyes moved across the crowd. Her service is now declassified as of 0600 this morning. The words landed like a decompression itself, sudden, necessary, releasing 7 years of pressure that had been building behind Elena's sternum. Classified. Declassified. The past had a permission slip now. The past had a name. Scalpel Wing. Some of the crowd didn't understand. But the veterans in the plaza, and there were 3 of them standing near Marcus's wheelchair, they understood perfectly. One of them, an older man with a Purple Heart pin on his jacket, closed his eyes. When he opened them again, tears had tracked down his weathered cheeks. Lowell's phone was in his hand now. He was backing toward the transit booth, his fingers already moving across the screen, trying to access the security system, trying to buy himself time before the inevitable happened. But a voice stopped him cold. "Mr. Lowell, I wouldn't do that." A man stepped out from the crowd, 40s, weathered, wearing a St. Michael's Hospital IT department badge with a Kandahar 2012 tattoo visible on his neck. James Reeves. He held a hard drive up like a piece of evidence at a crime scene, which, Elena realized, it was. Reeves looked at her with the kind of nod that soldiers gave each other across airport terminals, brief, complete, understanding everything. Then his attention swung back to Lowell like a weapon. "Funny thing about Transit Authority security systems," Reeves said, his voice steady as a surgeon's hand. "They're networked with the city's emergency services hub. The hub connects to hospital systems for ambulance coordination. When you called St. Michael's administration yesterday, you triggered a security event flag." Reeves stepped closer. "Standard protocol had me review all connected footage." He held the drive higher. The reporters pressed forward. Their cameras caught every frame of Reeves's face, every gesture. "I've got every moment of yesterday's incident. You mocking Mr. Webb. You interfering with Captain Martinez's emergency care. You making unauthorized calls to city officials who had no business being involved in a medical emergency." Lowell's face went from red to something closer to the color of old bone. His phone trembled in his hand. The screen went dark as his thumb fumbled. "You have no authority," he started, but Reeves was already talking over him, his tone suggesting this conversation had ended before it began. "I also pulled your voucher processing records when I noticed you'd accessed Captain Martinez's personnel file yesterday without authorization." Reeves's voice had hardened into something that sounded like steel cooling. 18 months of billing irregularities. Disabled veteran vouchers showing $47 in charges when actual bus fare is $12. I delivered a copy to the City Ethics Board this morning. Another copy went to the U.S. Attorney's Office. A pause. The kind of pause that breaks people. Since you're defrauding a federal Veterans Assistance Program, they tend to take that personally. The general spoke quietly to the second suit, who made a phone call. Elena watched Lowell's hands go through the stages of panic, clenching, reaching toward his pocket again, then dropping uselessly to his sides. Within 4 minutes, 2 Savannah PD officers arrived, moving through the crowd with the purposeful gait of people executing a warrant. One officer read from a tablet, his voice formal and final, "Richard Lowell, you're under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and misappropriation of federal funds." The handcuffs came out. They were old-fashioned steel, worn smooth from use. They made a sound like small bells as the officers snapped them closed around Lowell's wrists. He didn't resist. There was no fight left in him. As they turned him toward their car, he made eye contact with Elena one last time, his expression collapsing from defiance to something that looked like genuine bewilderment, the face of a man who had finally understood that the universe didn't rotate around his convenience. Elena's response was quiet, almost gentle, the voice of someone who had seen this moment in 100 different iterations across 7 years of carrying secrets. "So was I," she said. The crowd sound changed then. It wasn't applause exactly. It was something deeper, the sound of people witnessing something real, something true, something that had been hidden finally emerging into the light. The news cameras followed Lowell's car as it pulled away from the bus stop, but their reporters' eyes kept sliding back to Elena. The general turned to her, and there was something in his expression that suggested he had a great deal to say and very little time to say it. But Miguel got there first, throwing his arms around her, the shadow box with the medals still clutched in one hand. Elena held him, her hand steady against his back, and for the first time in 7 years, she didn't feel the weight of the past pressing down. It had surfaced. It had been named. It was becoming history instead of staying trapped in the present. 6 months later, Elena stood in an office on the 3rd floor of the Savannah VA Medical Center, the morning light streaming through a window that overlooked a therapy garden where veterans sat in clusters, talking quietly, healing quietly. This was her first day as Director of Emergency Services. The title still felt new on her tongue, unfamiliar but right. She was unpacking boxes, a desk lamp, a framed photo of Miguel in his ROTC uniform, a coffee mug that said "Mercy Always" when Miguel texted from his college dorm, first day. "You got this, Mom." She smiled at the phone, that particular warmth that only your kid could generate even when they weren't in the room. She reached into her jacket and pulled out 2 patches. Her own Special Forces medical insignia, embroidered with thread so old they looked like silver. And the faded 10th Mountain Division patch that Marcus had pulled from inside his jacket lining the day after the reveal, his hands moving in sign language that his daughter had translated with tears in her voice, "So you remember we're not invisible." Elena pinned both to a shadow box frame on her wall, next to her medals, which Miguel had insisted on displaying. The medals caught the morning light like a promise kept. A knock at the door. Marcus Webb in his wheelchair, his daughter pushing him, both smiling. The pneumothorax had healed completely. His lungs had relearned how to breathe without assistance. He was recovering the way soldiers recover, with quiet determination and the understanding that some things break you and some things make you stronger, and sometimes they're the same thing. He signed with practiced hands, movement Elena had started learning, 8 lessons so far and counting. His daughter translated, "He wants to know if you're settling in okay." Elena signed back, her hand still clumsy but getting there. "Thank you for coming." Marcus signed again, faster this time, his hands moving with something close to amusement. His daughter laughed before translating, "He says Lowell's teaching CPR basics at Savannah Technical College now. My boyfriend takes classes there. Apparently, Lowell makes $14 an hour and the students call him Vest Man because he's obsessed with proper AED vest placement." Elena walked to the window. The technical college sat across the street, its squat concrete buildings looking like they'd been poured directly into the Georgia heat. She could see into one of the ground floor classrooms, fluorescent lights, harsh and white, the kind of lights that made everything look smaller and sadder. In that classroom, a figure moved among rows of plastic CPR mannequins, setting them up in precise formation. Richard Lowell, stripped of his pension, blacklisted from government work, teaching basic life support to community college students who would never know his name or care what he'd done. He moved like a man who'd aged a decade in 6 months. The light caught his face for a moment and Elena could see the flatness there, not sadness exactly, but the particular exhaustion of someone who'd built their entire identity on power and found out, too late, that it was made of paper. Marcus joined her at the window, his wheelchair barely making a sound on the tile. He signed a question. His daughter translated, "Do you feel sorry for him?" Elena considered it honestly, watching Lowell arrange dummy after dummy in the harsh light, each movement smaller than the last. "I feel sorry for the person he could have been," she said quietly. "But I don't regret what happened." She turned back to Marcus. He spent his time accumulating power over vulnerable people. When that power was tested, it evaporated. She paused. Because it was never real. Marcus nodded slowly, his understanding complete without needing all the words. Then he signed one more thing. His daughter's voice went soft when she translated, "What is real power, then?" Elena looked at her office, at the veterans beginning their day in the garden below, at Miguel's text on her phone still glowing like a small light, at the 2 patches on her wall representing soldiers separated by decades and distance but connected by service. She thought of the needle decompression, of choosing to act when she could have stayed invisible, of her son carrying her medals into the sunlight. She thought of the pen held in a 3-finger tactical grip, of hands that had held lives together in the dark. "Power is not a title," she said. "Power is the ability to help." The morning sun streamed through the window and caught the medals, throwing their light across the room like proof of something true. And across the street, in that fluorescent-lit classroom, Richard Lowell pressed start on a CPR training dummies timer, alone in his small, white-walled world. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true strength, please subscribe and share this video. Your support helps us tell stories about the quiet heroes among us. Like, comment, and let us know, would you have handled this differently? We read every comment. Thank you for watching.